Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 20 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. I believe each episode in this series stands on its own, but if you're the sort of person who, like me, enjoys having the full context of a story, those earlier episodes are available to go back and listen to in the same place you found this one. Last time, I covered the event considered by many to be the high watermark of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. This week, I will cover the fall of Nikita Khrushchev and the concurrent rise of the man, the myth, the eyebrows, Leonid Brezhnev. This is The End of History, Part 20. How many of you have ever joined an organization to help you advance your career, even if you weren't fully committed to everything about that organization? I have. When I was a brand new lawyer fresh out of law school, I joined both the American Bar Association and the New York City Bar Association. Now, I don't have anything in particular against either of these organizations. Both of them are fine. But I joined without ever really having any intention of making any serious commitment to the organization. I joined and paid membership dues because I believed it would help me make connections that would advance my career goals. Thankfully, neither the American Bar Association nor the New York City Bar Association are particularly ideological in nature, except to the extent that they sometimes take a position on issues of public concern pertaining to the legal profession. So I was not really required to toe any kind of party line to maintain the benefits of my membership. But what about politicians? In the United States, with our two-party system, anybody who aspires to hold public office is pretty much required to join either the Democratic or the Republican Party, and then play the game to woo the party bigwigs into supporting their candidacy. And someone who expresses strong disagreement with any aspect of the party's platform is unlikely to get that support. How many politicians do you suppose, to some extent, suppress reservations they might have and toe the party line because they need the support of the party's establishment to obtain or to hold office? In my experience, it's pretty much all of them. If you follow the news on US politics, for example, you'll find that behind the scenes and off the record, many Republican politicians express that they strongly dislike Donald Trump and believe his impulsiveness to be harmful to our institutions. But in public, when the cameras are on, they are stalwart defenders of his every action. Likewise, when it's off the record, many Democrats will express concerns about the cognitive health of Joe Biden. But when the cameras are on them, they deny any such concerns and vociferously defend Biden's fitness and mental sharpness. Now, I'm not expressing an opinion here about either of the major American political parties or their leaders. I admit that in my private life, I do have such opinions, and those opinions tend to favor one side over the other. But that's not my point here. The point I'm making is that regardless of their party, politicians often make compromises and say things they don't really believe in order to maintain the support of their party establishment, even in a relatively free and open society like the United States. Now imagine, if you will, a society in which there's only one political party. A society in which that party was much more than just a political party, but also encompassed every professional organization, like the bar organizations I belong to as an attorney, as well as neighborhood associations, sports clubs, and even public libraries. In that society, not just politicians, but ordinary people must toe the party line to a far greater extent than politicians in the United States, because not to do so is considered a sign of disloyalty to the country and could, in certain circumstances, even be criminally punished. And yet most people must join the party and become full members if they want to have any hope of social or career advancement in that society. Not just in politics, but in every aspect of life. You probably don't need to do much guesswork to know that I'm talking about the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, millions of people joined the Communist Party not because they necessarily agreed with the ideology of the party, but because they wanted access to the benefits of party membership. One such person without strong ideological commitment to communism, Though he would certainly have denied it, I believe the evidence indicates was Leonid Brezhnev, the man who would rise to the very top and come to lead that party from 1964 until his death in 1982. Nikita Khrushchev, Brezhnev's predecessor, as we have seen in earlier episodes of this series, was more akin to the American politicians I mentioned before. He certainly had strong reservations about this or that policy and about Stalin personally, but he nevertheless strongly believed in the core ideals of the party. I think you'd be hard-pressed to make a case that Khrushchev was not a sincere communist. The same cannot be said for Brezhnev, Khrushchev's right-hand man who, through a dramatic act of betrayal, would come to succeed his mentor as the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the de facto ruler of the country. Leonid Brezhnev was born in Kamenskoye, modern Kamyansk, in Ukraine, in 1906 to a Russian father and a Ukrainian mother. Though his passport indicated his nationality was Ukrainian, Brezhnev confirmed in his own memoirs that he regarded himself as Russian. The Brezhnevs were technically working class, but Leonid's father, Ilya, worked in a rolling mill, essentially a factory producing thin metal sheets, owned by the South Russia Company, a company with a reputation for management that was relatively concerned with the welfare of its workers, at least as industrial concerns went in early 20th century Russia. So unlike many other proletarian families in eastern Ukraine, like the Khrushchevs who lived about 300 kilometers away in Donetsk, the Brezhnevs enjoyed a relatively comfortable life before the revolution. Ilya Brezhnev was adequately paid and had opportunity for advancement with the company, so that by 1917, on the eve of the revolution, Ilya Brezhnev was a shift supervisor at the same rolling mill where he had started 20 years before as an unskilled laborer. Unlike Nikita Khrushchev, whose family could not afford to keep him in school and forced him to drop out after 3 years to work and help support the family, Leonid Brezhnev's family placed a high value on education as a vehicle for their children's advancement, and Ilya Brezhnev was paid well enough to send all 3 of his children to primary and secondary school. Evidence also seems to indicate that though they were of working class origin, the Brezhnevs harbored distinctly bourgeois sensibilities in the years before the revolution. This is evidenced, for instance, by a professional family portrait taken in 1915, depicting the Brezhnev family dressed in their Sunday best, with young Leonid standing at attention in his school uniform. Poorer proletarian families like the Khrushchevs would never have had the money to pay for a professional family portrait, or even afford Sunday best clothing, and even if they could, would have considered it a waste of limited resources. Not so with the Brezhnevs. The family appears to have been religious, living in a home adorned with icons of the Russian Orthodox Church, and though Brezhnev would later go to great lengths to prevent discussion of the topic, it is likely that he was baptized. Brezhnev's later intentional obfuscation of his past make his father's politics difficult to piece together, but there are breadcrumbs available, so we can at least formulate a theory. Though there is no evidence that he was involved with any socialist parties and took no part in the revolutions of 1905 or 1917, Ilya Brezhnev is known to have participated in at least one strike to demand better working conditions in 1911. And Jewish neighbors who later left the USSR and could therefore speak more candidly about their interactions with the Brezhnevs recounted that during the anti-Semitic pogroms of the early 20th century, Ilya Brezhnev opened his home to them, providing protection and sanctuary to his Jewish neighbors from the anti-Semitic mobs rampaging through the region. From these tidbits, I think it's fair to surmise that Ilya Brezhnev's political beliefs were liberal, likely motivated by a belief in Christian charity, but were not revolutionary. When the revolution of 1917 broke out, like his father, Leonid Brezhnev neither supported nor opposed the Bolsheviks. And during the years of civil war, the Brezhnevs hunkered down and tried to fly under the radar, as Kamenskoye changed hands over a dozen times. As a teenager, Brezhnev does not seem to have had any passion for politics, instead preferring to read poetry, the poems of Sergei Yesenin and Vladimir Mayakovsky being among his favorites. He was also passionate about acting, belonging to several drama clubs and local theater groups. Though his passion was for the humanities, there were few prospects for poets or actors in the years of hardship following the Russian Revolution, and thus, young Leonid decided to study engineering. As an interesting coincidence, he first joined the Komsomol at age 17 in 1923, at the same time he was applying to engineering programs. At the time, acceptance into universities and technical schools was virtually impossible without connections in the Communist Party. The fact that he first joined the Komsomol at 17 while applying to engineering schools, and not 3 years earlier when he would have first been eligible to join, leads me to conclude that he was motivated to join by practical rather than ideological concerns. He officially joined the Communist Party as a conditional member in 1929. During the years of collectivization and purges, Brezhnev worked for the party as a land manager, helping to reorganize and allot the land that had been seized from peasants into collective and state farms. As he was a relatively low-level official at this time, and it would have been politically inconvenient to talk about it later, we don't know much about the extent of Brezhnev's role in the brutal Stalinist repressions of the peasants. If the rest of his career is any guide, he probably played some part, but only insofar as it was necessary to preserve his own career, and he probably did not zealously persecute anybody beyond what was expected of him by his supervisors. In 1935, Brezhnev finally received his engineering degree. He had pursued it on and off over the years, forced at times to drop out and work to support his family, having been married in 1927, and to focus on his party responsibilities. After receiving his degree, he took a job as an engineer in a metal plant, and it seemed that he was on his way to a career in industrial engineering rather than politics. However, the Great Purge of 1937-1938 changed the course of his career. As higher-ranking party members were purged, their posts were opened up to younger, ambitious party members, and in 1937, after his predecessor was purged, Brezhnev was offered the post of deputy chairman in his local Soviet. His local party boss, Alexei Viktorov, persuaded him to accept the position, and just like that, Leonid Brezhnev, the politician, was born. In 1938, Nikita Khrushchev became the first secretary of the Ukrainian Communist Party, and though they had met briefly in 1931, this is when he really became acquainted with Brezhnev. Upon taking over leadership of the Ukrainian Party, Khrushchev initiated a purge of the party's top leadership, and sought to replace them with younger men who owed their position directly and personally to him. Brezhnev was one of many young party members in Ukraine selected for promotion following the purge, and he was made propaganda secretary for the Dnepropetrovsk region in February 1939. When the Soviet Union was invaded by Nazi Germany in June 1941, Brezhnev was mobilized into the Red Army as a political commissar. Hardly a huge leap from his role as a propaganda minister. After Ukraine fell under Nazi occupation, he was transferred to the Caucasian Front, where he served under the command of, you guessed it, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the chief political officer for the front. We don't really know the full extent of Brezhnev's activities during the war. His own memoirs, ghostwritten for him well after he became general secretary, are a clear exaggeration of his wartime service. They even state at one point that Marshal Zhukov frequently came to him for strategic advice, when, in fact, the two would not even meet until after the war. It does seem likely, however, that Brezhnev, while he may not have been under enemy fire very often, was at least close enough to the front to be affected by what he saw. While Khrushchev is said to have been unable to stomach war films after 1945, Brezhnev enjoyed them, but was often moved to tears by them. Colleagues who later served with him as general secretary also almost universally say that his experience in the war, like Khrushchev's, deeply moved him and motivated him to seek compromise and peaceful coexistence with the capitalist West. Serving under Khrushchev during the war kept him on the future General Secretary's radar, and when Khrushchev resumed his role as first secretary of the Ukrainian Party after the war, he ensured that Brezhnev came with him, appointing him first as regional secretary for the Zaporizhia region, and then for his home region of Dnepropetrovsk. After Khrushchev was recalled to Moscow in 1949, he helped facilitate Brezhnev's promotion to the post of first secretary of the Communist Party in the new Moldavian Soviet Republic, comprising the modern country of Moldova, where he was charged with Sovietizing the Republic, which had not been part of the USSR, but rather a region of Romania prior to 1940, and had again been re-annexed to Romania in 1941 until it was overrun and re-annexed by the Soviet Union in 1944. You got all that? In 1952, Brezhnev was promoted again, this time being summoned to Moscow to serve as the Secretary of the Presidium, an important administrative position in the country's highest body of state. Throughout his rise in the party, Brezhnev developed a reputation as a strong, competent official. He was neither a bully who sought to impose his will on others through fear and force, nor was he easily intimidated or manipulated. He was the consummate party bureaucrat, a man who did his job competently, honestly, and according to a clear set of rules. He was not a jokester like his mentor, Khrushchev, nor was he a particularly inspiring leader, but he was not without humor or charm either. His colleagues came to regard him as safe, reliable, and moderate, not prone to extremes in any aspect of his personality. After the death of Stalin in 1953, he was immediately removed from his post as Secretary of the Presidium, as Lavrentiy Beria and Georgy Malenkov, Khrushchev's main rivals for power, identified him as Khrushchev's man and sought to sideline him. During the struggle for power, Brezhnev took one of the few real risks of his political career. He openly sided with and supported Khrushchev in his push to become General Secretary. His reputation as a moderate helped to win a lot of mid-level fence-sitters over to Khrushchev, and while it probably wasn't the most decisive factor in Khrushchev's victory, it was a factor. In 1954, Brezhnev's loyalty was rewarded, and he was named General Secretary of the Kazakh Communist Party. Here, he was tasked with implementing one of Khrushchev's pet projects, the Virgin Lands Initiative, a project meant to bring uncultivated steppe land in Kazakhstan under the plow and increase the USSR's food production, in line with Khrushchev's promise to match and surpass U.S. agricultural production. In the first few years of the program, it was actually a success, and the newly cultivated lands increased the overall yield of Soviet agriculture significantly. However, spurred on by these early successes, Khrushchev was determined to continue expanding the program until it reached and surpassed its limit. The problem was that in order to continue expanding the new farms in Kazakhstan, skilled workers had to be taken away from the more established agricultural regions of the USSR, like Ukraine, which in turn lowered the output of those regions and eventually led to stagnation in the Soviet agricultural sector. By the time that happened, however, Brezhnev had left Kazakhstan and moved on to bigger and better things. His timing was just right in that he was able to claim credit for the program's early success while avoiding responsibility for its later failure. As head of the Kazakh Communist Party, Brezhnev also played a significant role in the development of the Soviet space and ballistic missile programs, both of which were headquartered in Kazakhstan. In 1958, he was recalled to Moscow to serve as the economic minister in charge of the armament industry and the space program. Then, in 1960, Khrushchev helped ensure his election as chairman of the Presidium. This made him the Soviet Union's nominal head of state, though the real power still laid with Khrushchev as General Secretary of the Communist Party. Khrushchev also retained the post of Premier, the nominal head of government. The move did, however, effectively make Brezhnev the second most powerful man in the Soviet Union, and it demonstrated the trust Khrushchev had for Brezhnev and the high regard in which he held him. In 1962, Khrushchev made Brezhnev even more powerful, appointing him as the second secretary of the Communist Party, making him the second man in the party as well as the head of state. This move caused many at the time to speculate that Khrushchev, 66 years old in 1962, was beginning to think about retirement and setting Brezhnev up as his successor. If all had remained the same, Brezhnev likely would have continued his quiet support for Khrushchev and waited for him to retire. However, in his last 2 years in power from 1962 to 1964, Khrushchev was becoming increasingly erratic. The fallout from the Cuban Missile Crisis seems to have been a tipping point for him. Whereas prior to the crisis, he had felt secure in his position and didn't really worry too much about his colleagues conspiring against him, After the crisis, the popular perceptions among the Presidium and Party Central Committee were that he had backed down in the face of American ultimatums and humiliated the country, and that he had precipitated the crisis unnecessarily by putting the missiles in Cuba in the first place, provoking the Americans. As I covered in my episode on the Cuban Missile Crisis last week, there was a lot of nuance here that Khrushchev's critics didn't understand without the benefit of hindsight. And it's my opinion that Khrushchev's actions throughout the crisis were, at the very least, understandable. My opinion aside, the perception at the time was that the whole thing was bungled and mismanaged by Khrushchev, and he suffered a lot of criticism for his handling of the crisis. In response to this criticism, Khrushchev became increasingly paranoid about plots to undermine him, and rather than engaging with and charming his colleagues as he had always done in the past, he increasingly isolated himself from them. He had always been a joker, but his jokes began to take on a personal, often cruel nature, made at the expense of his colleagues in the Central Committee. He also developed a habit, heavily resented by his colleagues, of removing, recalling, and reassigning them as he pleased, without first consulting either with the individual in question or with the Party Central Committee. Coincidentally, Khrushchev had also decided the time was right to enact further political reforms. He divided the party's economic planning infrastructure into two separate divisions, industry and agriculture, a move that was seen by economic planners as unnecessary and unhelpful. It also forced career party bureaucrats to choose one track or the other, which many feared would limit their future prospects. At the same time, it was becoming clear that his Virgin Lands initiative was failing, and rather than admit the failure and scale it back, he sought to devolve agricultural planning decisions from Moscow to the local level, allowing regional planners with a realistic understanding of conditions on the ground in their region to set production levels. This was probably an excellent idea, economically speaking, but it led the high-level party members in Moscow responsible for planning the economy to fear losing their power and position, including a lot of members of the Central Committee, who had previously supported Khrushchev. Fearing the loss of their privileged positions, these erstwhile allies began to turn against him. Khrushchev at this time also pushed forward reforms for socialist democracy, which to him did not necessarily mean democracy in the sense most of us probably think of the term, but instead meant that there should be more turnover in the elected positions in the party and in the government in order to foster new, talented young party members' advancement, and thus continuously revitalize the party and the country with fresh ideas. Again, this was probably a great idea in principle, but it served to alienate the very members of the Central Committee whose support Khrushchev needed to maintain his own position. It's unclear what made Khrushchev think he could get away with these changes, because in hindsight, it's obvious he was never going to. I think the paranoia about his party colleagues played a role. He wanted them replaced with younger men who owed their loyalty directly to him, a less brutal version of the purge he had conducted in the Ukrainian party in 1938. But the days of the Stalinist purges were over. Khrushchev had seen to that himself. The men whose positions he now threatened were not afraid of him, and they were never going to give up their privilege without a fight. There's not a clear record of the exact moment when the Khrushchev-Brezhnev relationship was irretrievably broken, but if I had to guess, it was likely the Communist Party plenum on July 11, 1964, when, after watering down Brezhnev's power as second secretary by appointing a co-second secretary to exercise the powers alongside him, Khrushchev proposed that Brezhnev be removed from his position as chairman of the Presidium, stating that it wouldn't be fair for him to hold both positions. Khrushchev, however, did not just propose Brezhnev's demotion, but publicly insulted Brezhnev in front of the entire party leadership. When Khrushchev asked the plenum whether there were any objections to the change, the members began to applaud. He then turned to Brezhnev and said, quote, "Why are they applauding? They're pleased you're being removed," end quote. At this point, Brezhnev may have already joined the conspiracy against Khrushchev, but after, he definitely did. Brezhnev then, who, in spite of everything, Khrushchev still seems to have trusted absolutely, became one of the primary leaders of the conspiracy to oust him, along with Vladimir Semicastny, head of the KGB. As when Khrushchev had moved against Lavrenti Beria in 1953, it was crucial that both the Presidium and the Party Central Committee moved together and with unanimity. The task was made easier when Khrushchev publicly announced that there would be a major overhaul of the entire party leadership at the next party plenum in November 1964. It seems one of the only party leaders who did not join the conspiracy, and indeed seems to have been unaware of it, was the Armenian elder statesman who had replaced Brezhnev as chairman of the Presidium, Anastas Mikoyan. Aside from Mikoyan, however, the conspirators apparently approached the rest of the Presidium and the Party Central Committee to ensure their support for ousting Khrushchev. They were likely confident that when faced with a united front from the rest of the party leadership, Mikoyan would conform or at least not stand in their way. He may have been Khrushchev's friend, but he was probably not prepared to sacrifice his own career to protect him. The plotters finally struck in October 1964, seizing the opportunity when the usually energetic Khrushchev allowed himself to take a vacation. The unsuspecting leader was vacationing in the Abkhazia region of modern Georgia with his family and his friend Anastas Mikoyan when, on October 12, 1964, a call came in on the high-frequency phone he'd had installed in his vacation home, connecting him through a secure line directly with the Kremlin in Moscow. It was meant for emergencies. On the other end of the phone was Brezhnev. Brezhnev requested that Khrushchev return to the Kremlin for a special meeting of the Presidium the next day. Annoyed, Khrushchev asked, quote, "Why? On what issue?" End quote. And Brezhnev calmly replied, quote, "On agriculture and some others." End quote. Khrushchev told Brezhnev to decide things without him, but Brezhnev insisted the matters couldn't be decided without him, and eventually insisted on Khrushchev's early return. After he hung up the phone, Khrushchev discussed the conversation with his friend and advisor, Mikoyan, on a walk after dinner. He told him, quote, "You know, Anastas, I think they haven't got any urgent agricultural problems. I think the call is connected with what Sergei was telling us." Khrushchev was referring to a warning he had received from his son, Sergei, a few days earlier, that the members of the Presidium were plotting against him, which at the time he refused to believe. Sergei's own account of the plot alleges attempts to poison and assassinate his father. Clear exaggerations. While some in the party wanted Khrushchev to be punished, few wanted him executed, and nobody wanted to return to the days of Stalin's terror, least of all Brezhnev. The next day, resigning himself to whatever was waiting for him in Moscow, Khrushchev boarded a plane and returned to the Kremlin for the meeting of the Presidium. When he arrived, he sat in the same seat where he always sat, at the head of the table, and opened the meeting according to his duty as chairman. Brezhnev was the first to speak, stating that Khrushchev had, quote, "contradicted Lenin's teaching and sowed disorganization and division in the party," end quote. He accused him of ignoring others' opinions and of ruling through a Stalin-like cult of personality. Khrushchev began to defend himself, admitting that he had made mistakes, but that he considered the people around him as friends. Gennady Voronov, chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Russian Soviet Republic, cut him off, shouting, quote, "You have no friends here," end quote. Khrushchev could only respond with a question. "Why are you doing this? Why?" End quote. He was interrupted again. The minutes of the meeting do not record who by, but the person shouted, quote, "Wait a minute. You listen to us for a change," end quote. Khrushchev was then forced to sit in silence, as he was denounced in the harshest terms by each individual member of the Presidium. They denounced him for so long they couldn't even finish in one day. They actually adjourned the meeting to be continued the next day. Khrushchev was allowed to return home that evening, but KGB head Semychastny had ensured that his security detail was replaced by people loyal to the plotters. Semychastny also had all the phones in his home bugged, and each plotter agreed not to take any calls from Khrushchev that evening, lest he tried to recruit allies for the next day's meeting. The only call Khrushchev placed that night was to his friend Mikoyan. He told him, quote, "I'm old and tired. Let them cope by themselves. I've done the main thing. Could anyone have dreamed of telling Stalin that he didn't suit us anymore and suggesting he retire, not even a wet spot would have remained where we had been standing. Now everything is different. The fear is gone and we can talk as equals. That's my contribution. I won't put up a fight." End quote. The next day, Khrushchev returned to the Presidium and sat with his face in his hands as the denunciations continued one by one. Nobody stepped up to defend him, save Mikoyan, whose defense was half-hearted at best. He too joined in the criticisms of Khrushchev's leadership style, but defended several specific policies, including the decisions that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, reminding the Presidium that they had all voted to approve Khrushchev's decisions in the crisis. He also suggested that Khrushchev should be removed from his leadership of the party, but allowed to retain his position as premier, the nominal head of government. This suggestion was roundly rejected. Khrushchev then spoke to the party for the last time in his official capacity. Tears welled in his eyes as he recounted his years of service to the party and the nation, and yet he acknowledged his mistakes and accepted the outcome. Addressing the tears in his eyes, he said, quote, "These aren't tears of self-pity. The battle with Stalin's cult of personality was a big one, and I made a small contribution. You've already decided everything. I will do what's best for the party." End quote. When he was finished, the Presidium formally voted to grant his request to retire in connection with his advanced age and deterioration of his health. That evening, Mikoyan went to visit his friend, assuring him that his dacha and city residence would remain his, and that he would be guaranteed bodyguards, domestic staff, and a pension of 500 rubles a month. That's the equivalent of roughly $1,000 today. In truth, both his dacha and city residence were soon taken away, and Nikita Khrushchev would spend the remainder of his life under conditions equivalent to house arrest. In that time, he chose to focus his energy on writing his memoirs. Not always the most objective source, they are still an invaluable primary source for the period and are significantly more reliable than those published by his successor, Brezhnev. Those memoirs have been an invaluable source for the last few episodes of this podcast, and for that, I thank him. Khrushchev died in obscurity in September 1971 from a heart attack. Though his death was heavily covered abroad in the Soviet Union, his only recognition was a one-sentence announcement buried at the bottom of a page in the Communist Party newspaper Pravda, regretfully announcing that the former General Secretary had passed away. The question of succession was not immediately clear in the short term. Brezhnev was the consensus choice to replace Khrushchev as General Secretary, leader of the party, but he was rivaled by Anastas Mikoyan, who remained chairman of the Presidium, the head of state, and by Alexei Kosygin, who replaced Khrushchev in his role as premier, the head of government. It was initially envisioned that the three would govern together as a troika, a Russian word that roughly translates as triumvirate. But as time went by, just as Stalin and Khrushchev had done before him, Brezhnev would gradually use his power as General Secretary of the party to consolidate all the power in his own hands. I will cover that process in my next episode. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, I want to give a special thank you and shout out to my patrons and supporters who donate to the show through Patreon and Spotify. If you're not a supporter yet and you want to be, links to both can be found on my website at www.thehistorysphere.com. If you can't afford to donate right now, you can also support the show by following and engaging with us on social media. I'm most active on Instagram and TikTok, but I do maintain other social media profiles as well. Links to all of them can be found on the website. If you're interested in what my sources for this week's episode were, that information is also available on the website. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. As I say every week, the most common way people learn about new podcasts is by word of mouth. So you can also support the show by telling your friends how much you're enjoying it and encouraging them to give us a listen. Next time on The History Sphere, I will cover the years of the mid-1960s as Leonid Brezhnev consolidated his power and clarified his political philosophy. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.